Number 1.
When I was a teenager, I did some work for the public library in my hometown. I suppose I should say at this time I was a young blonde teenager who was, and still is, extremely socially awkward. The library was only a few blocks from the bus station, so it had a significant transient population. That bus station also happened to be where the local authorities released prisoners, so you never really knew who would come through the door. Homeless individuals would come into the library every day to nap along the shelves or lounge chairs. Before I started there, I heard it was a regular occurrence to find used needles and other drug paraphernalia in the library pretty much every day. When I started working there though, we actually had a wonderful security guard who built a relationship of respect with the homeless community. They listened to him and respected him, and most of the time there wasn't any issues. Still, on occasion, someone would be kicked out, or we would find things like a puddle of urine on the floor, or a bunch of used tissue shoved into a book in the darkest corner of the library. And I'll tell you this, whoever used the tissues did not use them to blow their nose. I'll leave it up to your mind to fill in the rest about that. It was primarily my job to return the books to the shelves, so I would take a heavy cart of recently returned books from the circulation desk, sort them, and wheel the cart around the library, putting the books back on the shelves. The library had a large central atrium with a glass ceiling, and several chairs meant for reading and relaxing arranged in the center. The shelves all circled around that atrium, so you could basically see the whole library from the shelves. I became familiar with the regular homeless patrons that would come into the library and sit all day and sleep. Most of the time they never spoke to me. They just minded their own business. At one point I did start to notice that one man would stare at me the entire time I went around the building. He would just sit in the atrium and stare. I didn't try to engage him, but being the naturally brainwashed to be polite person that I am, occasionally if I glanced up and saw him staring at me, I would involuntarily smile. Big mistake. This went on for a few weeks with no real incident. It wasn't until one day I was updating our bulletin board near the back exit that anything happened. The area where the bulletin board was located was separated from the main library with two giant doors. The restroom also happened to be located near there. As I was going through the board, removing the really old posts, I heard the men's bathroom door open up behind me. That man came out and beelined right for me. He really got close and introduced himself as George. This man was well built and tall compared to my short stature, with dark hair. George then proceeded to babble on about how he wasn't Mexican, how he was a Native American from Mexico, and he had his green card. He called me beautiful and just kept repeating himself over and over. I have no idea what prompted this, and initially was caught off guard, and was frozen to the spot. After a while, I started to panic, as he was getting more and more excited as he spoke, gesturing wildly with his hands as he kept repeating himself. I started edging back towards the main atrium, and after a few minutes, I managed to tell him that I had to go back to work and escaped back into the library. I was a bit unnerved, but just shrugged it off as a fairly regular homeless instance, considering the poor mental health of most of the homeless who come into our branch. I didn't really mention it to anyone. Fast forward a few weeks, and I'm shelving books as normal. I hadn't seen George for a while, but he came in today and was as usual sitting in the atrium staring. I rounded a corner near where he was sitting, focused on my task, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw him leap up and head my way. He approached me and quickly grabbed my arm. I immediately panicked and tried to get out of his grip, but it was rock solid. "Hey Blondie, what's your phone number?" He then started to babble again. I was so panicked that I couldn't even think of a response, so I told him that I didn't have one. Stupid, I know. I was frantically looking around for any of my coworkers to help. He continued to hold my arm tightly, and no one was in sight. "Hey, what's your number? I want your number. You're so beautiful. I have my green card." He continued to squeeze my arm. Luckily, one of his friends popped up and started in on the conversation as well. I said luckily because after a few minutes of them talking, he finally let me go, and I backed up until I could book it back behind the circulation desk and into the employee break room. I burst into tears from the buildup of panic and explained everything to the security guard, who then escorted George out of the library. I was definitely shaken this time. However, I tried to tell myself that it wasn't really a big deal and that it was over. Wrong. A few days pass, and no George. I relaxed and got back into my normal routine at work, and I continued to make myself shrug off that incident as a bizarre random occurrence. I glance up, and who do I see but George entering the library from the back entrance and glaring daggers at me. He beelined it for me as I immediately started to head to the safety of the circulation desk. "Hey, you got me in trouble," he shouted as he made his way toward me. "You need to come outside and talk with me now." Completely panicked, I started trying to run away from him. He lunged at me and I dodged behind a table. He was yelling at me the entire time that I needed to go outside with him and talk. He chased me around a table a few times before I was able to bolt for the desk. The security guard heard the commotion and intervened in the situation. George was permanently banned from the library after that instance. In the weeks that followed, several other women and staff mentioned that he had been harassing them as well. Apparently, he would go into the bathroom and get drunk, leaving beer cans everywhere. I never went to my car alone at night after closing the library after that. I saw George one more time at a public parade downtown. He was heading out of the public bathroom. He luckily didn't see me, so I abruptly turned around and went in the other direction. Who knows what would have happened if he had managed to get me outside. I've managed to move on and no longer work at that library or even live in the same town. But whenever I visit, I always have half an eye out for George.
Number 2.
This story takes place in February of 2010, when I was a month off my 14th birthday. I live in a small city in regional Australia with approximately 47,000 people. My friends and I at the time had a habit of heading down to the town library after school, as it was a nice, quiet place where we could socialize and relax before heading home. It was a fairly nice library that was lenient with food consumption and general social activity, so long as we didn't disturb other people. One day it was only my friend Annie and I. We were sitting at a public computer that had another computer behind it, so the person on that computer was facing us, and we were facing them. At the other computer sat a man, possibly in his late 30s, who asked us politely if he could use a pen. I had grown up as a shy, cautious girl who was short for her age. I kept quiet as Annie, who was also 13, cooperated with the man's request. I was hoping this encounter would be the only one, as I'm not comfortable or fond of talking to strangers. He got up from his computer and came around to our side of the table to use her pen, but he didn't write anything. He just scribbled on a piece of paper as he spoke to us, in a hushed voice. "Hey, do you guys see that strange man over there?" We both looked around to see a tall, middle-aged man who had been standing around the bookshelves in this area of the library. I had noticed him earlier, but of course, I didn't think much of it. The guide told us to be careful, as he had noticed the indigenous man was watching us for a while. We told him that we would be careful, and he went back and sat down at his computer. Annie and I didn't think much of it, though we thought it was weird, but it didn't set off any warning bells. The next day I came down with my best friend Jessica, and we sat down at the other end of the library we frequented. It consisted of a small table surrounded by a couple of chairs and couches. We had our shoes kicked off and food and drinks on the table. We were just chilling out and chatting. We hadn't been sitting there for long when the creepy man from before showed up again in the area that we were sitting. I remembered what the man had said to us yesterday, but I didn't linger on it for long. From what I recall, he looked at some books and wandered off. My older brother Thomas showed up soon after and sat down with us. Even though I get along with my brother, who was 16 at the time, I was kinda hoping that he would go look at some books or a computer, so Jessica and I could enjoy each other's company. It wasn't long after having that thought that the man came back, and I was instantly hoping that Thomas wouldn't go anywhere. But he only stayed with us for about 5 minutes. There were other people nearby, and a couple of librarians walking around, so I wasn't really worried. That was until he started to look at us more openly. I could literally feel his eyes on me, and I could see through my peripheral vision that he was looking through the bookshelf at us. He would also stand out in the open and quietly talk on his mobile phone, but at the same time, I had assumed he was pretending to use it. I felt at the time he was being way too preoccupied with staring at us to have an actual conversation. That's how obvious it was. When he would look away, I would give him the biggest "what the actual fuck" expression, hoping Jessica would catch on, but she never showed any sign that we were in the same boat. We continued to act normal, but I could feel myself getting more and more restless, and if anything, annoyed with this guy. After half an hour of this, he walked down to the other end of the library. Neither Jessica nor I mentioned it to each other, and continued to casually talk and laugh. Then, out of nowhere, a librarian walks up to us, and in a serious tone says, "Could I see you in my office for a moment?" I thought she was going to get on to us about being loud or eating food or not wearing shoes, something ridiculous like that. She opened the door to a small office and we followed her inside, feeling quite awkward and anxious about the situation. What shocked me is when she asked, "Now girls, do you know the man in the blue shirt outside?" We both glanced out of the office window to find the man standing less than 20 feet from the office, staring right at us. When he notices that we're looking at him, he turns around and quickly walks straight out of the library. "Oh shit. No we don't," I managed to get out. "Well, someone has filed a complaint that he's been looking at teenage girls, and we are aware that he's been watching you." That distinction between the word looking and watching really set me on edge. I proceeded to tell the librarian about my encounter the day before with Annie and the nice man who warned us. "Okay, I just want you to know that we're watching him, and it would be better to have an adult or a parent nearby, okay?" We opened the door and left the office. "Are you okay?" I asked my friend Jessica as we walked back to our seats. Yeah, are you?" "Yeah," I chuckle, but it's really not funny. Turns out Jessica was very aware of the man watching us and noticed him a lot more than I did. He had been coming here again and again for the last year. After she told me this, I think I had some vague memory of him. This is something that I never expected. I've never seen myself as good looking or fit, so it was actually a very weird experience. I'm not sure how much longer it was before we had one last encounter. I have a feeling it was the same week. I was at the library with Jessica and Annie, hanging out in the manga section, which is in front of the computers we sat down at when we were first warned about the guy. I don't remember if I saw him walk into the library or around our area, but we were all sitting on the floor in front of the bookshelf when he approached us. Annie was sitting cross-legged, facing the bookshelf. Jessica was sitting on her knees beside her and was also facing the bookshelf. I don't quite remember what position I was sitting in, but I was sitting at the end of the bookshelf, so I could have a perfect view of the small area behind it. This next memory is so vivid, it's as clear as the moment I was sitting there. I look up, and there he is, standing behind the bookshelf, eyes burning through the gap straight down at Annie's crotch, and I will never forget the automatic danger and discomfort I felt. It made me sick to my stomach. His eyes, they were red, and I don't mean his iris was red. I mean the whites of his eyes were completely red. I shit you not. This freaked me out beyond anything else. Jessica had also spotted him, and without another word, we both convinced Annie to stand up and come over to the computer with us. The man left a minute or two later, and we filled Annie in on what just happened. Thomas was currently sitting at that computer, and when Mom came to take us into town for whatever reason, we were painfully adamant on Annie not leaving Thomas's side. As we walked out of the library and around the corner onto the main street, he walked past us back in the direction of the library. Jessica and I both silently freaked out and sent Annie a text saying that he was coming back. We got finished doing whatever we were doing about 20 minutes later, and we went back to pick up Thomas, and Annie stayed in the library until her mom came and picked her up. We kept texting each other until we made sure she got home safely. That was the last time we ever saw him. At the time, I didn't want to tell my mom in case she would ban me from going to the town library after school. I now know how ridiculous that was, and I obviously didn't realize the serious situation this actually was. I still haven't told my parents or my brother, but I think now I'll sit them down and let them read this.
There's always a reason to be afraid.